Okay, we're going to look at the six core principles that are the building blocks for the Constitution. And we're going to look at how those six core principles lay the groundwork for how government acts or government actions that are taken in the present day, in its present day form. So, one of the Federalist Papers that you will be required to have more than a glancing knowledge of is number 51. And in 51, Madison lays out his rationale for government. And in it, he says, government is, after all, the greatest of all reflections on human nature. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels governed men, no controls on government would be necessary. But men govern men. There are in the present no angels that would influence the conduct of politicians. And so consequently, Madison talks about the security measures that are necessary to control the abuses of government, thus underlining the six core principles of the Constitution. So, what are the six core principles? Well, the good question we have to ask ourselves is, why are these core principles necessary to maintain democracy? Well, you can probably lop off a few of them, but then you don't have a fully functioning modern democracy. And you might say, well, then we don't anyways, if you're certainly feeling as if government is failing you. But here we have those six main principles: popular sovereignty, federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances, judicial review, and limited government. Now, these theoretically create a government that serves the people, though one of the reasons that we find ourselves in the political conditions that we do in 2016 are because people don't feel that the government is serving its people, that the people are there to serve the government. And that since government is perhaps disconnected from the people at this point, the abuse of power is beginning to perhaps grow, and people feel threatened on a number of sides, while others feel not threatened at all and want the government to expand its power to make people's lives better. And that is kind of the gist of the current, in very simple terms, the current political situation that we find ourselves in between the left, which features a more, or wants a more active, bigger government, and the right, which wants a smaller, less active government. The issue for the last 30 years has been to respect the rights of the states. And remember, Amendment 10 talks about those powers not given to the federal government or the national government are reserved for the states. It just doesn't say what they are. And that is where, with the rise of the conservatives in the 1980s, that's kind of where we've been. Maybe the pendulum is swinging back a little bit. I'm not sure, with a Supreme Court tied at 4-4 right now, and the likelihood of President Obama not getting his nominee even considered. And here we are within 2 months of an election, 3 months of 3 months of adjournment of this term of Congress. It doesn't look like it's going to happen for his nominee. So, popular sovereignty. Why is it important? And it's simply popular sovereignty is the power to the people. I'm not sure that the people feel that they're all that powerful right now. And certainly government feels that it has the authority that it's been given by the people to administer itself in the way that it is. In simple terms, popular sovereignty means the authority of the government comes from the people, ruled by the people, blah, 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 blah. The problem with that is it's not simple. The problem with that is, especially when your electorate splits, and there's now a big gulf. You have certainly on one side a favoritism toward what the government is doing. On the other side, it's as if large group of people have put their heels into the ground and don't want to move that way. And it might mean, if you look at the Gallup polling of just the simple question, do you think the country is on the right path? And consistently, 2/3 of Americans say the country is not on the right path. Now, I'm not saying that those 2/3 all believe that the path that we should be on is the same, but I'm just saying that 2/3, based on Gallup polling, and it's been rather consistent, feel that the country is on the wrong path. When a country is on the wrong path, to be able to say that your authority comes from the electorate is damaged. So we'll see what happens in this election and the succeeding elections to see if we go farther and farther away from that principle. Because remember, when you look at the voting statistics, you have, if you have 100% of the voters, you're never going to get them to the polls. Americans vote or register at least with about 50% of that 100%, which means that when there's a very close election, a quarter of the people are making the decisions. And even though the 50% who don't even register and thus don't participate, even though they are not registered, they may also be unhappy, and they may feel disenfranchised, which might be the reason why they're not even registered in the first place. But really what you've got and what you've had in the last 2 to 3 decades is about a quarter of the population, a quarter of the voting population, making the decisions for the rest of us. I'm not sure that when we say we the people, that we mean all the people. It might mean that we are the people who live in the blue states, not the people who live in the red states, or the people who live in the red states and not the people who live in the blue states. Since we've had presidents representing both sides since 2000, since the election of 2000. Now you see an old-fashioned ballot box there on the left. You see people practicing their First Amendment rights in the top right, and of course you see the preamble to the Constitution, which is populated in huge print by the term "we the people." Now federalism gave birth to a kind of dual system. Though this may not be clear here, you can see a very, very similar chart in your book. There are powers which have been determined by the Constitution and the courts using judicial review that are predominantly in the purview of the federal government. We see those on the left. We see things that are in the purview of the states on the right, and then we see the shared values in the middle of this kind of Venn diagram when it comes to how the country rules itself. So there's things that are specifically national, things that are specifically state, and then there are a number of things that are shared by both levels of government. And remember, when we look at the state side, and to some extent the national side, but primarily the state side, when we talk about the state, we're also talking usually about local governments. Though, when it comes to things like education, the power resides at the national level, state level, and local level in significant ways. So when we look at the things that are, in addition to education, the things that could be present-day examples, traffic laws, for instance, most of those are established at the federal level, at the local level. But at the state level, there's a requirement that you have a license. The state may also require that you have insurance. That's not usually a county thing. The federal part of this could be that you're traveling on an interstate highway within the state of California, and your speed limits may be 65, 70, 75, or they may not be anything at all. But normally 75 is by far the highest speed that you can take on a federal highway. If you are hijacked, your car is hijacked in the conduct of a crime, that's now federal law rather than a state law because of some very horrific carjackings in the 1980s. Immigration laws are primarily in the federal purview, but the states struggle with actions taken by the national government. Gun laws vary with every state and every jurisdiction in those states. So the County of Los Angeles has a different set of gun rules than that in the County of Kern, and et cetera, et cetera. And then there are, of course, some national gun laws that people have to follow too, which are things like registration and background checks and things like that. And then, of course, there are taxes. There are federal taxes, federal income taxes. There are state income taxes. There are local property taxes. There are, which pays for schools. There are any, license taxes to drive your car. There's any number. There's, of course, a sales tax. We don't have a national sales tax that many countries do, but we certainly have state income taxes, and we have county income taxes, and we have city income taxes, sales taxes. So these things, in many cases, they overlap, and they can be very confusing to the population when they see it. So here's some pictorial examples. Of course, the left-hand corner is an anti-Second Amendment advertisement using the icon Uncle Sam, pay your taxes. Caution, people crossing. That's at the border. And then traffic laws are strictly enforced. So that can be everything from speeds to not crossing over double line to the fact that certain places you can't park in certain places, like the white painted curbs on the south side of Highland, which are there for drop-offs, and that's it. You can't park there permanently, otherwise you will get a ticket. Now, you can see in the distance here, it almost looks like Los Angeles, but it's not. I believe this is could be New Orleans. It could also be a number of other cities where either heavy flooding has occurred or a hurricane has occurred. And the federalism question is this: who is in charge of helping victims of disaster? Well, it's the three-pronged attack. There, of course, is FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which can be anywhere in the country. Then there are the state emergency management agencies. California has one, New York has one. Then there are the ones that are located in the cities. I was looking at the Weather Channel this morning, and they were saying that Hermine was in the area, so New York City had activated its emergency response center. So national and state governments, this is where that, especially after 1937, where people want both of the levels of government to participate in helping them recover from something that isn't their fault, something that's not the government's fault. But in this way, it's a private sector, state sector, and national sector response to a national disaster, be it flooding, hurricane, earthquake, tornado. I remember sometimes the feds have to step in because a tornado doesn't get to the border of Mississippi and Alabama and then stop, saying, "Oh, we're not going to cross state lines." State lines are irrelevant when it comes to everything, as far as natural disasters go. And so this is sometimes where the federal government has to step in and help the states out, because the states may not be fully equipped to handle a widespread and devastating emergency. Now, as a libertarian, a leaning libertarian, limited government is important to me. And why is it important to me? Well, limited government says that a government with unlimited power cannot truly serve the will of the people, because when you have unlimited government, the government is serving itself. And we've seen historically, just in the 20th century, what governments can do when they have unlimited power. Lenin and Stalin in the USSR, Mao Zedong in communist China post 1949, Pol Pot in Cambodia, the Kim family, the Kim dynasty, communist dynasty in North Korea. The people are serving them. The people are serving the state, which is the old Roman model. It's not the government serving the people. So the Constitution limits government by establishing guidelines for how the government may act. And the government can only do what the Constitution says it can do. And this is why we have judicial review, because things that are in the Constitution are not always clear. And so judicial review certainly has helped. And prior to 1936-37, government was more limited than it is now, because the court itself has become more, especially in the 1950s and 1960s, by then has become very active and inserted itself into issues that went beyond the narrow focus of federal power or state power. So present-day examples would be things like your First Amendment rights. The government cannot restrict our freedom of speech. Separation of powers and checks and balances are also examples. In fact, the president's willingness to pursue his policies at the expense of the Constitution when it came to immigration issues was struck down by the court, which, even though it was a 4-4 tie, the appeals court had said, you have exceeded your power. Therefore, you cannot order changes in the law just because you don't like the way the law is written. That is certainly the court checking the executive branch with the agreement of the legislative branch. So we see the pie is cut three ways: legislative, executive, judicial. We see that it affects a lot of different things, from free speech, checks and balances being the interplay between the branches. And then we see here that the 28th Amendment, Congress shall make no law that applies to the citizens of the United States does not apply equally to the senators and representatives, and Congress shall make no law that applies to the senators and representatives that does not apply equally to the citizens of the United States. I can see where sometimes that isn't followed. For instance, Obamacare, where the rest of us had to thrust upon us. Congress exempted itself and other parts of the government from being forced to buy Obamacare, and the reason for that was because their medical care, which was paid for by the government, really was the gold standard, and they were unwilling to give it up, but they were certainly willing to thrust the rest of us into a pile in which, as we can see now, as it spins out of control, it really is beginning to fail, because it was never well written. 2,800 pages, and it's still not well written. It is what it is for now. Now, judicial review is critically important because the judicial branch was not given the power of judicial review explicitly in the Constitution. And what the judicial review means is that the judicial branch has its own means to balance the other two branches, known as judicial review. It's not until you get to Marbury v. Madison that the court, by reviewing Marbury's case, and Marbury said that what Marbury was asking for, of course, was that Jefferson follow the decision made by Adams to put Marbury on the bench, and that was based on the Judicial Act of 1790, And John Marshall, who is now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, saying that the court didn't have the power to order Jefferson to place Marbury on the bench. Just the act of reviewing the Judiciary Act of 1790 established the concept of judicial review. So what has happened since then is that judicial review has become really important in looking at the actions of Congress, even more so looking at the actions of the executive branch, and also looking at actions that have been propagated by states and local governments. So when you see some of the cases reaching the Supreme Court, you'll see that some of them are very narrowly focused and are very specifically grounded in a small area of law, while others will have a large-scale effect, whatever way the court decides. So for instance, when the local gun ordinances in Chicago and Washington were reviewed under Heller, the court, for the first time, defined what the Second Amendment actually means. And they defined it in a way that a majority of Americans look at it, which means that you have the ability and the power to own guns. And in a sense, they overturned those anti-gun measures in Chicago and in Washington, D.C., though they have been put back on the books within the confines established by the courts. So any law that is found to violate any part of the Constitution is said to be unconstitutional. So any concept is also part of that. So separate but equal, which became an unwritten part of the Constitution in 1896, was found to be unconstitutional in 1953. The concepts that are provided for in the First Amendment, speech, religion, assembly, etc., have all undergone constitutional stress tests to see what is viable and what isn't, as far as how the law can be interpreted. So we know that, for instance, freedom of speech is not a right that is complete or inviolate, because you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater, because at times the courts have found that the safety of the population is greater than your right to say whatever you want. But for the most part, you can say whatever you want as long as it doesn't cause physical harm to someone else. Now, unconstitutional laws cannot be enforced by the government and are void. So even if the government agrees, and I can tell you probably in 1962 with the first of the court decisions on religion, most of local and state governments probably disagreed. And yet, they are now the law of the land. So I cannot tell you to say along with me the Lord's Prayer or something like that, because it violates the separation of church and state. And even though government doesn't like it, and even though most people don't like it, if I feel that the only way to get the attention of the government is to burn the flag, I do have that right. It's what we call symbolic speech, as you'll find out more about later on. So you see here in this cartoon, it's either constitutional or unconstitutional. We don't use a scale of 1 to 10. They don't, but I'm sure in those meetings that they have every Friday, as they discuss the oral arguments they've heard prior to that Friday meeting, it may not be a scale of 1 to 10, but boy, the minds and the rhetoric and the speeches that the representative justices give behind closed doors, there are There is no one else in there. There are no clerks. There are nobody else. The meeting is presided over by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The person taking notes is the least or the less serving member of the court. So right now the Chief Justice is John Roberts. The person who joined the court last is Elena Kagan. So Elena Kagan is the one taking notes until a new one comes along, and then she can give up the note taking to the youngest serving, or the least serving justice, for at least as far as years go. So judicial review simply is the power of the courts to determine the validity of the acts of the legislative or the executive departments of the government. Very simple, but very, very powerful. So let's look at another example of judicial review. Congress passes a law. The president signs the bill into law. So right now you have two branches that agree on the law. Now the president may not like some nuances in the law, but the president can perhaps mitigate some of those concerns by telling the executive agencies to put it into practice in this way. But a citizen in California doesn't like the law, so they file a suit in the federal courts. The federal court, the district court, looks at it. It then gets appealed to the federal appeals court. The federal appeals court still doesn't satisfy the beliefs that the citizen feels is being violated, and then the case goes to the Supreme Court. Now, in many cases, a appeals court will find its decision overturned, especially if it's the Ninth Circuit Court, which is the most left of the appeals courts, the 12 appeals courts in the United States. When the Supreme Court rules the law unconstitutional, it's a directive to the rest of the government that you have to start from scratch. This law is not valid. It does not need to be followed. And so, for instance, even a better example is the fact that there have been there was an attempt by the legislative branch and the executive branch to mitigate Texas v. Johnson, which allowed for the burning of the flag. So there are ways around judicial review, but it usually means amending the Constitution, and that is really, really difficult to do. In fact, in a Senate that was very favorable at the time, it could not get a 2/3 vote. It was 1 or 2 votes short every time it's been introduced. So it hasn't been introduced lately. And most likely it would fall just a little short in getting 3/4 of the states. But there are ways around judicial review, except that the ability to do so is really difficult, and the odds are against you. Now there is some things that are interesting, that there are laws in place that are questionable. So with checks and balances, not only does the Constitution prevent the concentration of power in any one branch, but it also gives each branch the authority to check or restrain the powers of the other two branches. And the reason that the War Powers Act is here is that the War Powers Act, if it's contested in the courts, will probably be found unconstitutional. It was passed in 1973. It has a number of things that require the executive branch to meet. The first, of course, is it requires the president to tell Congress within 24 hours why he or she is sending troops abroad. And then and that's okay. That's probably not in any way unconstitutional. But the next is, in the law it says that a president can conduct war for a total of 60 days. And if troops are engaged in battle at that point, they have another 30 days to do what they have to do and then cease operations and come home. The problem is war is never that easy. And the problem too here, at least constitutionally, is that where only Congress has the power to declare war, the person who conducts the war is the president. The president is the commander-in-chief. and to limit the president's ability to conduct war is unconstitutional. Now, Congress can do it, but they can only do it in certain ways. So, for instance, Congress can say, okay, Mr. President or Madam President, you can go to war, but we're not going to pay for it. And if we don't appropriate the money, then you can't go to war because you can't send troops over because there's just no way to pay for it. So the power of the purse can be a great constraint. But the War Powers Act is probably unconstitutional, but I thought I'd bring it up now. And also, you're being introduced to a new word this time, the veto. The veto is in the purview of the executive branch. They can receive a piece of legislation from Congress, and the president has two options. The president can sign the bill, which means that it becomes law, or the president can veto the bill, which means that it is sent back to the House and the Senate. Now, at this point, the president has probably already told Congress that he or she is going to veto, and so therefore Congress has already probably made the changes that would make the law more palatable to the president, but it doesn't always happen. And the reason that Congress doesn't really take the risk is they know that the chances of overcoming the veto or overriding the veto, which requires a 2/3 vote of both houses, is probably nil and none. So the president has the veto power. The president also has the power to nominate men or women to the Supreme Court and to the other federal court benches. But that's as far as he or she can go. The Senate then has the power to confirm presidential nominations for the Supreme Court. And it can be, especially since the 1970s, a really messy affair, which is why the nominees are heavily vetted. And what we mean by that is they want to know everything about you. They want to know your bank accounts. They want to know everything you've done. Can you account for everything since you were probably 18? And they want to know about your paper trail. And what that means is what are the decisions that you've been part of. But so anything that is heavily negative probably will keep you from being nominated to the court, simply because a president does not want the embarrassment of having a nomination defeated in the Senate. And in the Senate, it goes from the president to the Senate Judiciary Committee, which does their own investigation. If they say yes, then it goes to the floor of the Senate, and the full Senate will, after hearings, the full Senate will vote yes or no. Now, separation of powers works a little bit differently. The framers took Montesquieu's ideas and gave each of the branches specific duties, so that there is a little bit of replication, but there's also a lot of variance. So we know that the first three articles of the Constitution list the responsibilities of each branch. The legislative branch is pretty well filled out. The executive branch, less so. The judicial branch only talks about the Supreme Court. There's no mention of lesser courts, though the founders said the legislative branch has the right to establish those lesser courts, and it did with the Judiciary Act of 1790. So Article 1, Legislative Branch, Article 2, Executive Branch, Article 3, Judicial Branch. You guys have done the summer work. You kind of know where these are. So an example of the separation of powers is that the legislative branch produces legislation, has a bicameral legislature, House of Representatives, and a Senate that have very different rules, and even between the two bodies in the legislative branch, they operate very differently. The executive branch is the president, the vice president. The judicial branch, of course, is the Supreme Court. All of them have varying and very different powers that they use in order to counteract the actions of the other two when they feel that those actions have a reason to occur. So what are examples of separation of powers? Again, let's look at legislation. Nowadays, the budget comes from the executive branch that changed in the 1970s. So the president makes up the budget, but at that point, the president, that's as far as they can go. The budget is sent over to Capitol Hill, and there the budget goes to the House and the Senate, and they tear it apart and they make additions and they change numbers and so on and so forth. The president's decisions are defended by members of his own party, or the opposition party will make changes. Revenue bills can only originate in the House. They can be voted on by the Senate, but they have to originate in the House. Revenue bills are, how are we going to raise money? How are we going to raise taxes for this, to pay for this? Now, that means that there's appropriations committees and things like that, but that's all done. By the time it gets back to the president, the federal budget has been massaged by the legislative branch, and now it goes back to the president for signature. So the president starts the process, but that's as far as he or she can go. When the president gets the budget back, he basically kind of has to accept it. Now, he can veto the budget, but I'm sure there's been enough interaction between the executive and legislative branches before it gets to that point so that they have talked, and the president usually, because he needs the money to operate anyways, usually doesn't veto the budget. So the money trail starts with the executive branch. The budget stops here. The legislative part is nothing that the executive branch can touch. The budget's torn apart, put back together, changed, whatever, in the legislative branch. And it goes back to the executive branch to put into play if the president accepts it. In the impeachment process, somebody on the court does something bad. The president, in this case, the executive branch, has no part of it. The charges are brought in the House. If the House accepts that the charges are true, they then vote to bound the official over to the Senate for trial. If the Senate finds the judge guilty, then the judge is removed. And again, the executive branch has no play in it. So we can see that sometimes the judicial branch is frozen out, sometimes the executive branch is frozen out, sometimes the legislative branch is frozen out. Examples of checks and balances: the veto, the president vetoes, Congress has the veto override. Both houses of Congress, not the Senate, not just the Senate, not just the House. The president signs a bill, the Supreme Court finds it unconstitutional. Is there a way around it back then? Yeah, there is a way around it back then. Congress produces an amendment that is passed by 2/3 of both houses and 3/4 of the states. So there are ways around it, it just doesn't happen. So you can see that for everything the government does, separation of powers and examples of checks and balances mean that government is inefficient. And if we look at those two, that was the way the founders wanted it. They wanted government to be inefficient. They wanted anything that was going to happen to have to climb over so many hills so that we know that it's important if it does happen. It also keeps tyranny from happening, because even though in the 20th century the executive branch has grabbed far more power than probably the founders would feel comfortable with, there's still a process involved, and the executive branch can't tell the other two branches to go take a hike. It all kind of works in somewhat of a balance. And this is why Madison felt so strongly. You know, they dealt with King George III, they dealt with tyrannical government, and tyranny was something that they feared. And by making the government inefficient, it puts the brakes on tyranny. I'm sure Madison probably had some other reasons too, but for me, it is about tyranny. So we see here, as we revisit the Madisonian model, this is in your book, and again, you can see here, you can pause this and look at it, but these are just some examples, some of the powers, and some of the examples of how those powers are balanced through checks and balances. Now, most of this discussion of the Madisonian model, it's a subheading in your text. You should look at it, probably page 4950. This is the 14th edition. They mention here we use the 13th edition, and what you should do are again list in your notes what are the key features of the Madisonian model. What ideas did he borrow from John Locke? And that way you have to review, again, natural rights. And the question is, do Madison's ideas protect us from the abuse that he warned against? Well, 230 years later, we don't have a king, we haven't had a dictator. Um, uh, Demagogues have not found a way to the Oval Office, so maybe it has worked. We're not going to do the scavenger hunt. We have the summer work. You guys pretty much know your Constitution. You proved that on the quiz. I'm not gonna give you this assignment. But thanks to the Lucas Foundation and the people for putting that in there, because my regular kids are going to do it.